Yeah, it's something that we always do, that we want you to know every time a baptism happens. It is those decisions that have often been shown to change the trajectory of someone's faith. And these are that is just one of, and it's a very significant one, but that is one of a handful of decisions that you'll make in your life. That really can change your life. And so that's why we bring all the kids in. We want them to see that. We want them to be inspired by that hopefully they'll be able to make that same decision for themselves in the coming years as we continually tell them about Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus and what it means to believe in Jesus. And with all of that being said, we're excited to come into this Christmas season as we consider Christ having come into the world. And today, what we're really going to be focused in on is that path that Jesus came to us on. How it is that he came to us so unexpectedly through the people that he came through us from. And it is as we see this unexpected path that Jesus is on, what we learn in that is that Jesus came from unexpected people and he came for unexpected people. And it's often whenever Jesus intersects into our life that we don't quite expect it, but we're always better for it. And so having said that, we're going to read a passage of Scripture here at the beginning that you probably haven't read, or many of you haven't heard ever in a church setting. So we're going to make sure that we get through these scriptures, these verses, and then we'll talk about some of the significance of who it is that Jesus came through. So we're going to begin reading in Matthew chapter 1, starting in verse 1. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Abinadab, Abinadab the father of Nahshon. And this is the point at which you realize, yes, we are going to read the whole genealogy. We're going for it. Nahshon, the father of Salmon, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose father was Rahab, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed, the father of Jesse, Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother was Uriah's wife. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam, the father of Abijah, Abijah, the father of Asa, Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram, Jehoram, the father of Uzziah, Uzziah, the father of Jotham, Jotham, the father of Ahaz, Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. And you thought your family was complicated. Okay. Manasseh, the father of Amon, Amon, the father of Josiah, Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father. Yeah, this is whenever the names get really complicated. Shealtiel, and Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel, Zerubbabel, the father of Abihud, Abihud, the father of Eliakim, Eliakim, the father of Azar, Azar, the father of Zadok, Zadok, the father of Achim, Achim, the father of Elihud, Elihud, the father of Eleazar, Eleazar, the father of Matthan, Matthan, the father of Jacob, Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. And so as we look at this list of people, Matthew gives us this list, not to bore us, but in truth, really to shock us. This was, again, a very unexpected list to receive. If you, just as an analogy, if you think about the NBA draft and you were to look at these kinds of names, none of them would have been in the lottery. In fact, very few would have probably even gotten a 10-day contract at best. I mean, it was that kind of a list. But it is through these unexpected people that we realize that the Messiah has come for, indeed, unexpected people. This group is full of broken people, outsiders, stories that shouldn't have worked out, but somehow they did because of God's grace. What you see in all of this is that God's grace shines through even the most challenging, difficult, unsettling situations and even people's stories. And somehow that grace was able to change the world. And what this teaches us is that Jesus' his story, where he came from, really matter. Origins matter. And the path that he came to us on is not, again, one that we would have expected. Mark jumps into adult Jesus. Luke gives a detailed history of Jesus. John opens with a very poetic beginning of Jesus. But it is Matthew that teaches us where Jesus came from. And what we see in this, just from a faith standpoint, is faith is not just learning about Jesus. Faith is learning where Jesus came from and who it is that he is. And so, with that, we realize the significance of his reality, of his real history. Just the same that you have a history and I have a history, we see that. And when we think about the world that we live in, and we can look at where people get to, like maybe they get to a very prestigious university, Harvard, maybe they get to a certain sort of political position, a senator, or even some type of secretary, cabinet position, or even president. You can kind of look at that story, or even an owner of a franchise, something along those lines. You can look at those individual stories and see, I can see how that path worked out. Yeah, this person in their family was able to be a congressman, and this person was able to be a senator, and this person was able to get to this other higher echelon, or a governor, or something like that. You kind of see the path. They came from that type of university, so they end up at this type of university. It's very rare that we look at somebody's story and say, how did you get to this place? Like, what was it that inspired you to pursue that particular path? And in very much the same way, when you look at Jesus' story, this isn't the one that you would expect, but it gives credibility and credence to who it is. Because you wouldn't mention these names if it weren't true. One example I think that's very important, one story from the Wycliffe Bible translators that gives credence to the importance of the genealogy is of a woman. She was sent out to a very remote tribe that didn't have a written language with the Wycliffe Bible translators. If you aren't familiar with that organization, they translate the Bible into very obscure and often incredibly unknown languages that will reach often handful or maybe a few dozen or a few hundred people at best. And this group of people that she went to was one of those such groups. They didn't have a written language. And if you can think about that, that means that they don't know how to read, they don't know how to write, they at best know how to talk, and that's it. And so she spent 10 years with these individuals, learning their language, beginning to put it into an alphabet, understanding all the grammatical nuances and tone and verbs and adverbs to their language, and then she began to teach it to them. And as she was teaching it to them, she was also translating. She decided to start with the Gospel of Matthew. And she wanted to get to the main parts of the Gospel of Matthew. So after 10 years, she was able to get this gospel translated, but she skipped the genealogy. She went to the stories. And then one fateful day, that translation of her showed up on a truck. And she was so excited to hand out the copies of this gospel to this village. But then what she came to find out is that the people there weren't very interested in this gospel track of Matthew. They were more interested in the truck. In fact, they were incredibly enthralled by this piece of machinery that they've never seen before. And then, not one to give up, she decides to produce a second edition of this gospel, not seeing any converts. And after the second edition was printed and given to her, she began to read it to the chief of this tribe. And instead of just starting with the story of Jesus and his birth, she started with his genealogy. And as she worked through those verses that we just read, the chief stopped her. And when he stopped her, he said, "Wait a second. You mean this Jesus that you've been telling us about for 10 years?" And it's almost comical that he would say this. This Jesus that you've been telling us about for 10 years is real? Like he has a heritage? He has a lineage? Because to them that mattered. Who their father was, their grandfather, their great-grandfather. That's how this guy became a chief, was who he came from. So that mattered a lot to them. That was a significant detail that she didn't realize mattered. But when they realized that Jesus was a real person, they were willing to embrace and believe in the grace and the mercy and the compassion that was available through him. The chief would convert, the rest of the tribe would eventually follow suit, and it all came back to them realizing that Jesus was a real person. He wasn't a counterfeit Messiah. And that's the first thing that we learned from this genealogy. And there's two points I'm going to make here. The first is this, is that Jesus is not a counterfeit Messiah. He is the real Messiah that has come into our world. And the way that Matthew goes about linking this genealogy to give Jesus credibility is this. Matthew, first of all, links Jesus to Abraham's promise. The people of Israel knew that all of the world would be blessed through Abraham. And that blessing is Jesus. All the people of the earth will be blessed through you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 3. Matthew links Jesus to David's royal line. They knew that the king would come. They didn't fully understand it. They didn't understand a heavenly kingdom, but that's what the connection was. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12 and 13, God gives his promise, I will establish the throne of David's kingdom forever. And Jesus is that king. Matthew links Jesus to the identity of Israel. That their identity was found in Abraham, in David, and it was also in that remnant that came back from Babylon through exile. The remnant of the faith. And Matthew links Jesus to a supernatural birth. Did you notice the subtle shifting of language there at the end of the genealogy? Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus. In that genealogy, it's always the father of, the father of, the father of, but not Jesus. Jesus wasn't that. It was just the mother of Jesus. In other words, Jacob, while he would raise Jesus, he was not going to be considered a parent necessarily as it would relate to the way this genealogy is laid out. And then that fulfills the promise from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, the virgin will conceive. Jesus doesn't fit the pattern of counterfeit messiahs because he is the real one. One of my favorite stories of a fake messiah is of a woman named Jemiah Wilkinson. And hopefully none of you will ever have to meet somebody who thinks they're Jesus or thinks they're like the Messiah, reincarnated. Hopefully you never have to deal with that because they're generally those individuals are wrestling with some type of mental illness. There was only one Messiah, and he has come, and he has died, he's risen from the grave, and he's ascended, and that's Jesus. But years ago, 1752, there was a woman named Jemiah Wilkinson who said that she was a daughter of God. She had come into this world as the child of God. And she was somewhat charismatic, and as a result of that, 200 people began to follow her. And it probably, as history would say, maybe it's a little bit more than that. But one of the things that began to create skepticism about her was one of the stories was she's in Rhode Island long ago. They're walking through this wooded area. They come upon a lake. And when she looks out at the water, she sees this as an opportunity. And she looks back at this group and looks out at the water and looks back at the group, and then she asks them, do you believe that I can walk across this water? Obviously making reference to Jesus. And when he would walk on water, and they look at her and they say, yes, yeah, we believe. And then she doubles down, triples down even. She says, do you believe that I can walk across this water? And they say, yes, we believe. And she says it one more time, do you believe that I can walk across this water? They said, yes, we believe that you can walk across the water. And then she says, good, then I don't have to. And she walks around the lake. And it was stories like that would ultimately, unfortunately, create skepticism in who it is that she was saying that she was. And she would eventually become somewhat sick, and then right before she passed away, she promised after 3 days that she would rise again. And with that, she would pass, and then the followers would wait for her to rise again. The third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, and eventually they realized she wasn't going to rise again. And they all just trickled away, and this movement of hers passed away. But this movement that we are a part of, that is Christianity, this is something that has survived, it is sustained, because Jesus Christ wasn't a counterfeit Messiah, he was the real one. And what we also realize, first of all, again, is that Jesus wasn't a counterfeit, he was real. The second thing we realize is that God uses real people, not ideal people. That this Jesus, this real Messiah, didn't come into the world to just rescue the greatest of us. He came to rescue all of us. For example, we can look at a few different names, not all of them, but I tell you, almost all of them have a story, just like all of us have a story. Jacob, he was a man who wrestled with God. He was a man who was a swindler. He was a liar. He was a cheat. Really, he's one of the worst stories to get written into Jesus' story. But yet he's still there. And the wrestling that he would do with God, literally and spiritually, would ultimately leave him with a limp. That as he wrestled with God to get his blessing, to attain the blessing, God would touch his hip. And with that, he would have a limp the rest of his life. And in a way, I'm guessing many of you can kind of relate to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Like, we ought to wrestle with God. And you've wrestled with God and still maybe ended up with your marriage going through divorce. You've wrestled with God as you've watched a child walk away from the faith. You've wrestled with God as maybe your health has continued to decline. You've wrestled with God as perhaps a career path that you were on ultimately fell apart and didn't take you to where you thought that it could take you. You've wrestled, we've all wrestled with God. And in that doesn't mean that you always come away without some scars, without a limp. And Jacob wrestled with God and he walked away with a limp. Rahab was a woman who had a past. She was a prostitute. And just think about that. That isn't just a minor sin. It wasn't like every so often she lost her temper. No. Her livelihood and the success of her livelihood depended on how promiscuous she was. And yet she made a decision. She made it a faithful decision to align her life with God's will. She helped some spies. You can read the story in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. But it was in that alignment that her life and her family that would come after her was forever changed. One decision. It reminds me of a friend of mine who, a good friend of mine, and he's a pastor, and he's a pastor who's done some pretty incredible things. He's written some books, and he has sold millions of books. He's influenced millions of people. His father was a man who led a church of several thousand. He was a president of a university that trained up ministers that were sent out into our country and even the world. And you hear a story like that and that path that family has had, and you think they must have come from generation after generation of faithful Christian believers and pastors and itinerant preachers. There's something there, just generations and generations of it. But the truth is there wasn't. There isn't that. In fact, as he would tell me the story, he said, it was my grandfather that changed everything. My grandfather, he said, wasn't a Christian. He didn't attend church. And as far as we could all tell, as he would say it, he was never going to believe in Jesus and he was never going to start attending church. But then one day, a new pastor came to town. And as was the case, this was nearly 100 years ago, as was the case, the pastor would go around and introduce himself to everybody in town. He would knock on the doors. And when he knocked on my friend, his grandfather's door, he was very hospitable, invited him in. They talked. The pastor learned a little bit about the family. And as they were talking, there was this little boy on the floor playing with the truck. And then the pastor extended an invitation to the family to come to church. And that man decided to come to church that coming Sunday. And every Sunday after that, as he realized, this is something I need to have a part of my family. And that little boy that was playing with the truck was my friend's father, who would go on to lead a university, would go on to lead a church of thousands. And his son would influence millions. And it all went back to one person making one decision, even in spite of the past that they had. And they had somewhat of a scandalous past. That grandfather, my friends, his wife, she had become pregnant before they were married. And in that day and time, talk about getting a scarlet letter. That was something that could get you one of those. And even in spite of that one decision to go to church, to ultimately believe in Jesus, it changed the next generation, and it changed the generation after that, and millions of people have been impacted by that. One person, one decision to align with God's will. We can never underestimate what that can be. And that's what we have with Rahab. And then you have Ruth, who is a Moabite. She's an outsider. She was somebody who by Israel's, at least as far as Israel was concerned, was cursed. She was a foreigner. She wasn't anybody that was that was going to be accepted in. And you see these different stories, and then you get to the third set of 14. After the exile, everything's kind of a mess at that point. Everything's seemingly getting rebuilt. You see people like us. No kings, no prophets, no heroes, just ordinary, unknown, everyday people that lived, had families, and died. And God delights in using unknown people in very unforgettable ways. And what you see in all of this genealogy is God's grace coming through and him seemingly just saying, yes. Yes to all of us. And as he does that, in essence, what he's waiting on is us to say yes to him. And we think about the ways that we want to change the world. Every 2 to 4 years, right? We try to change the world. Every 2 to 4, that's the way we look at it. Legislation, politicians. We try to change the world through force. We try to change the world through wars. We try to change the world through all sorts of different things. And the reality is that Jesus has given us the game plan to change the world. And it's just through faith in him. It's through the transformation not of laws, but it's of our hearts. And when we get that right, culture and society and cities, they have no choice but to change because all the people have changed. And that's what we really need more of. Chuck Colson, he's the late Chuck Colson. He's a man who started a ministry called Prison Fellowship. And it was from him, unfortunately, having spent some time in prison. But he realized as a man that was very active in politics prior to starting this ministry, that Jesus is really what the world needs. Not necessarily more laws or more rules, not to say that those things aren't needed from time to time. But he would travel the world and he would look at different prisons and he would see how it is in these prisons that he could offer support to them to make them environments that would truly lead to rehabilitation. And as he went around the world, he saw so many different things. He saw murders, like people that were committing murder, had committed murders, and he was in spaces where their people were murdered, and they were just awful environments all over the world, even here in the States. But he was invited to one prison that he had heard about that had really gone through a dramatic transformation. It was in Brazil. And the government essentially was spread thin, and they didn't have the funding, they didn't have the resources to get this particular prison in line. And so they handed it over to some Christian leaders. And they said, look, we can't handle this prison. We don't have the resources for it. You can run it however you want. And so these leaders implemented immediately Christian principles and allowed the scriptures to guide the way they governed that particular facility. And Chuck Colson had heard that it was going pretty well. And when he arrived there, it was going better than he could have possibly imagined. Because you found, whenever he arrived, inmates who smiled and were hospitable and were friendly. He saw people that actually had the joy, like a joy of the Lord truly coming from them, even in spite of the fact that they were in a prison. He found people that were not scared of one another, were not continually looking over their shoulders because somebody there might hurt them. He found an environment that was clean, that was neat. He found people that even though they were in prison, they were truly free. He had a guard, a host that would take him around the facility and show him some of the different things that they were doing. And they had scriptures, Psalms, and Proverbs written all over, continually reminding them how it is that they needed to live and what it is that they needed to align their life with. And then the host said, I'd like to take you to one more cell. And this is actually the only cell where we have somebody there who we have to keep confined. And so Chuck Colson would walk back through the halls into this deep corridor, into this isolation chamber, essentially. And then the guard looked back at him and said, "Are you ready to go in and meet this individual?" And Chuck Colson said, "Yes, yes." And the door opened and he walked in. And when he walked in, he didn't find a person. Instead, he saw a cross. And the guard said to him, the only one here still doing time is Jesus. And he is taking on the punishment that we all deserve. And then he quoted to him from Isaiah 53, and I'll read this verse to you. He, referring to Jesus, took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. And by his wounds, we are healed. And the man would say, he is the one who is doing time for all of us now. And Jesus comes to each and every single one of us in a very unexpected way, down an unexpected path, to reach us. No matter what path it is that we've come to him, he's going to meet you where you're at, and he's offering you grace and mercy and compassion in that place, and hopefully healing as well. We all have wounds, and it is those wounds that often create the chaos and the anarchy that we see in our world, the headlines that are written in a variety of different articles, and even some of the own dysfunction that's within us. And as a result of our hurt, we hurt others. And so Jesus and God having sent his son into this world, not to condemn it, but to save it. And to offer us a healing that only he can offer. And in that healing, we get to offer the world a hope that'll never disappoint. A hope that'll point them towards something that causes them to not to ever have to depend on a politician or a piece of legislation or some type of force or some type of war for good to come into this world. Instead, it comes into this world through a transformed and a changed heart. And so whatever the path is that you've come here, it is not one that Jesus cannot relate to. No matter how promiscuous you might have been, no matter how broken your family might have been, no matter what divorce or bankruptcy or failure you have experienced, in all of it, there is a grace that can enter into your life, and with one faithful decision, everything can change. Jesus has said yes to you. And it's really our responsibility at this point to simply, in faith, say yes to him. We're going to have a word of prayer, and we're going to enter into a time of communion. Father, we are indeed grateful for the grace that you offer us all. And even in spite of each of our shortcomings, even in spite of us living for ourselves, we come to you now and pray that we would die to ourselves. And that in that, Lord, your mercy and your compassion can do what only it can do. And that's to change us from the inside out, to be your hope into this world. We're thankful for the healing that you can offer our wounds. And it's in this time now that we are going to reflect on that and be grateful for it in the name of Jesus. Amen. If you've called on the name of Christ as your Lord and your Savior, we invite you into this time of communion. We encourage you to take these few moments that you're going to get to reflect on his body that was torn and his blood that was shed. If by chance you didn't receive the elements when you came in, our host will be happy to bring those to you now. Just raise your hand as we invite you into this time of communion, and our team will lead us in another song of worship.